Okay, guys, we're going to get rolling in Genesis chapter 29 tonight. Genesis chapter 29, working our way or continuing to work our way through the story of Jacob. Last week, we kind of introduced ourselves to Jacob as a young man, a man who loved to lie and cheat and steal and deceive and bargain. And now, here tonight, I like the way one writer put it, that God is going to hold up a mirror to Jacob. The way God will help Jacob grow spiritually is through one man, a man named Laban, a man who will eventually become his father-in-law. And what we're going to see, if we haven't seen already, is some of the same themes repeat themselves. Like if you go back in the story of Abraham, you see some of those same parallels in the story of Isaac. We're going to see some of those same stories, those same themes appear in the story of Jacob tonight. And you may notice them as we're working our way through our study tonight. But we're going to start there in Genesis 29 verse 1, where Jacob is on a journey. Remember last week in Genesis 28, where Jacob is fleeing his family. Why is Jacob fleeing his family? Why is Jacob on the run? Esau's mad. Why is Esau mad? He took his birthright. And Esau's mad. He's getting out of town. He gets to Bethel and he sees the stairway to heaven. And he's continuing that journey eastward to his father's family and his grandfather's family. And he sees a well. And this well is actually going to pop up in the New Testament in John chapter 4, which is an interesting story to kind of look at on your own time. But he gets to this well, and the large stone covers the opening of the well. And the shepherds would roll away the stone when all of the flocks got there. You know, rather than rolling it 3 or 4 times or whatever, just wait for everybody to get there. We'll open it up, let the water flow, and then we'll close it back up. Well, the shepherds get there, and Jacob asks the men, "My brothers, where are you from?" "Well, we're from Haran." "Oh, I know some people from Haran." It's like when I have people traveling through and they say they're from Tennessee, it's like, okay, what part of Tennessee? You know, we know some folks. And they're like, "Well, do you know Laban?" Yeah, we know Laban, so on and so forth. And the shepherds tell them, "Hey, look, here's our custom. Like, we don't roll the stone back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. We wait for everybody to get here, and then we roll it once." And while he's speaking with them, he looks off in the distance and sees Laban's daughter coming up, and like so many guys do, when they see a pretty young woman, he shows off. And he rolls away that stone by himself. And he kissed Rachel and wept loudly and tells the story, relays information that were related. They run home to Laban. Laban hears the news and kisses him there in the text. And he tells Laban, like, "Hey, I want to marry your daughters." But real quickly, before we get to that story, look at verse 17. It tells us that Leah had tender eyes, and Rachel was shapely and beautiful. We don't exactly know what tender eyes is, but the contrast there in the text maybe hints at us that maybe Rachel was really, really pretty, and Leah may not have been as pretty, perhaps. There's a contrast there in the text. And Jacob loved Rachel. And so they make an agreement. "I will work 7 years for her." The average price of a bride in the ancient Near East at this time was about 30 or 40 shekels. And the average income of a shepherd that year, at that time, was about 10 shekels a year. So do the math. 70 shekels over 7 years. He's paying basically twice the price you normally would to get Rachel. And so they come to a term because Jacob's madly in love with Rachel. And they have a feast. They have a wedding. And there in verse 23, Laban took his daughter Leah and gave her to Jacob. Wait a second, Leah? Okay, keep reading. He gave her to Jacob, and he slept with her. Laban also gave his slave Zilpah to his daughter Leah as her slave. And when morning came, there was Leah. He woke up with the wrong woman. And he said to Laban, "What have you done to me? Wasn't it for Rachel that I worked for you? Why have you deceived me?" So how does Jacob experience being deceived here in Genesis chapter 29? What happens? Yeah.
He has to be drunk.
Yeah. Yeah. So to your point, because a lot of times we hear it's like, how do you not know who you're marrying? Like, so the way I did a little bit of research and trying to understand the culture from that time period. The best we can understand is women would wear veils, like that maybe perhaps only expose their eyes, which is why when you get to like Song of Solomon, it spends a lot of time talking about the eyes in Song of Solomon. And so that's all he saw. And so you throw in the possibility of a lot of alcohol and not only seeing her eyes until the wedding night. So you're drunk as a skunk and you've only seen the eyes and it's your wedding night. You do the math. And so there's like, he's been deceived. Yeah, Craig?
I think it's ironic that Rebecca switched the sons and Laban switched the daughters.
Exactly. Yeah.
On both sides.
And that's what I wanted. I'm glad you caught that, because that's one of the things we're going to see in Jacob's life is a lot of the deception he does or he participated in is going to happen to him. There's like this philosophy in the ancient Near East called lex talionis, law of twos, law of equal retribution, that if I punch you, you punch me. You know, Jacob deceived in terms of younger as an older. Same thing's going to happen to him here. Yeah.
We don't have the Ten Commandments yet, but it just seems like God chooses not to call out things that he's told us in the New Testament are sinful
Yeah.
in the Old Testament. So you see like this wild drunkenness. You see it when
Yeah.
Lot's wife sleep with Lot, like
Yeah.
where the men are so drunk they have no idea what's happening.
Yeah.
And God doesn't say a word about it as if it's wicked.
Yeah.
Right? And you see a lot of like polygamy. God doesn't say a word about it.
Yeah.
Like it's wicked, you know? And you see God comment on Abram giving Sarah to Haram after Haram.
Yeah.
But he doesn't call them out and say, that's not being a good husband. I'm asking you to protect your wife.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And you don't see him call out Lot for saying like, here, take my daughters.
Yeah.
Like, why doesn't God call out all these wicked acts of wicked?
You know, that's a good question. The way I kind of wrestle with it and process it is while the Bible often doesn't directly come out and say, and Abraham sinned or Isaac sinned or in this specific way, what it does show us is the consequences of that sin. And so when you see, let's say, going back to Noah in Genesis chapter 9, when he gets drunk, there is the consequence of a curse against a son. You see consequences to these sins, whether it's polygamy, whether it's drunkenness, throughout the patriarchal story in Genesis, that I think the writer is trying to tell us, or wants us to infer that, hey, these things are not good. That polygamy has consequences. There's wife rivalry. We're going to see wife rivalry tonight in the story, spousal rivalry. We're going to see sibling rivalry, that parents should love both kids equally, and there's consequences when a parent doesn't love both kids equally, or when parents show favorites. There's consequences when people get drunk or people commit sexual immorality. There are consequences to sin. And so I think the writer, rather than calling out and saying, this is sinful in God's eyes, a lot of times just shows us the consequences and wants us to infer this is not good. That make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was thinking, because similarly, like, Jesus, when he's talking about marriage, refers back to
Creation.
Genesis and creation. creation, and says that that was how, like,
Yeah.
you should have known, like, been able to see that and figure it out that it was supposed to be one man, one woman. But the other side of this, and that we kind of can consistently bringing up, is, I'm not trying to justify them, but this is their culture. Like,
Yeah.
all of these things, none of these things are unusual for them. And while I think we see the consequences of them not living according to the way that God wants people to live, we have the lesson of their example to learn from, but we also have the lesson of God's patience and mercy. I know that, like, we're Church of Christ-wise, like, we're really quick to say culture doesn't define morality, and I think that's true. God defines it. However, you see here God being really, really patient, and all these people that are doing all these wicked things, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob,
Yeah.
Noah, like, all these people are listed in the New Testament as examples of righteousness and
Yeah.
faith. And so I think, like, on one hand, being, like, kind of checking ourselves to be too quick to judge others, and two, like, just kind of walking into this without judgment, like, just read it for what it is, like, not, like, yeah, it seems gross or weird, or we dislike it from our cultural standpoint. It was all normal to them
Yeah.
from their cultural standpoint.
Chris?
So the Bible in total is not a morality narrative.
Yeah.
That's not the point of it. The law was.
Yeah.
The law pointed out what was wrong. You know, here's the transgressions. In certain cases, prior to the law, like the drinking of blood and other things, those are actually patriarchal laws,
Yeah.
not and you know, murder was the same way. And so some of these things are stated explicitly, but that's not really the purpose. The purpose is to show God's patience and love and preeminence as king and creator, and prepare the way for this promise. And that's where you see this thread from Abraham on of this promise, and you see the first echoes of it back all the way in Genesis 3, because that's the purpose of the book. I mean, he could have written a book and said, okay, now let's do a few chapters on why polygamy is really a horrible idea, or let's do it. But God, you know, the 3,000 years that was happening, or 5,000, I don't know, whatever that time frame is, that's less than a blink of my eye to God. I mean, so we look at things in our own time-bound structure, but that's not the way God operates overall.
Yeah.
And so that's where I think that's where you get. So I think Kevin's right. I think what we want to do is we want to sort of backtrack and justify the things God says in the New Testament to apply to a culture in the Old Testament. God hasn't really applied it and hasn't really narrated on it.
Yeah.
So just don't worry about it, other than to understand that the nature of God, anytime there's no way that God not giving a narrative on Lot's actions is not an endorsement of Lot's behavior.
Yeah.
But we want to do that. We want to make that leap, but that's not a fair literary leap.
Yeah. Lisa?
So, I'll admit to having a bias here.
Okay.
But my counterpoint to Chris and to Kevin is you're looking at it from man's point of view. Like,
Okay.
when we look to the Old Testament, see how God treated people, women got treated terribly in the Old Testament. And there is no rebuking for God for that behavior, right? And so when I want to see how Jesus treats women and it builds me up, I go to the Old Testament and I'm like, gosh, right? Does God even care, right? You see God go after Hagar. You see God give Sarah a child, but you don't see him stand out or even rebuke men for a lack of caring for their wives. Like, that's why I'm like, it bothers me, these stories that act like it doesn't matter. Like, we think lots, oh, here's my daughters, and we go, oh, that was bad. Like, no, that was terrible.
Yeah.
Like, that was terrible,
Yeah.
right? We see Abraham give Sarah away, and no one says, He put his wife in sexual slavery so he would be safe. Is that how we want our men to behave?
Yeah.
Right?
But
It reflects on God if there's no wickedness there.
yeah,
If God's fine with it.
no, and I don't think that God's fine with it. It's just like, I think to Chris's point, the Bible is using these examples that these are broken men, and God in his grace is using this family of broken men to accomplish his greater purpose. And he's including these stories of these broken men to show us and display God's grace and God's mercy and God's patience, that he is able to use these people who are committing these awful, heinous, terrible things, handing your wife, your daughters over to the men there in Sodom, whether it's Abraham giving his wife, or Isaac giving his wife to Abimelech, Abraham to Pharaoh. All these stories, they're, and the consequences of it were meant, at least I believe, to say, these are awful, these are sinful, but God in his grace uses them. Uses these broken people to accomplish his purpose. And here's why I think this is good news for us. Because we're broken too. That God in his grace still is able to use me and you. Now, we may not be committing the same sins, that we may not be handing our daughters over, as Lot does in Genesis 19. We may not be handing our wives over to Pharaoh to say, have fun, she's my sister. We may not be getting wasted like Noah and so many other patriarchs in the narrative. Jacob tonight. But God in his grace is still able to use us, despite our flaws. And for me, yeah, I see what you're saying, Lisa, because you see so many of these stories in the Old Testament that are hard, that we have to wrestle with.
And Jesus calls it out in the New Testament.
Yeah.
He who without sin throw the first stone. Like he's much more active about identifying mistreatment.
Yeah. And so it is a complicated. I don't say this to diminish your point, but to kind of ride this line of realizing that polygamy was in fact part of life in the ancient world. And it is wrong according to God's standard, because that creation standard that Jesus talks about goes all the way back to Genesis 2. It's not Mosaic, it's creational. And how we should treat our wives. But it's also the result of a broken world.
Well, there's no endorsement of or even a whitewashing of Lot's behavior. It was abhorrent. But I do think that it's really easy, just as it's easy for males to put a certain bias on, for you to put a certain bias on our culture today and where we are today. That wasn't what you're experiencing today. Wasn't this way 50 years ago even.
Yeah.
So it's, and that's why I'm saying it's very difficult for us as humans, men or women, in our current state, to try and navigate. There were the worth that many of these women at that time in that culture, that was giving birth.
Yeah.
Childbearing was you see that tone there. And that may not be the culture today. That may not be the worth today, or it may be. But that was one of the components then. And I guess my point is that I can have biases for sure, and I think all of us can have biases based on the culture we live in today to try and apply those things before. There's no doubt that Jesus clarifies a higher level of love and parity and value, but he's still, in the New Testament, there are things like 1 Corinthians 12 and other places that talk about gender roles and other things. There are.
Yeah.
And so Jesus and the people inspired by the Holy Spirit still made cultural nods that even as they exclaimed the total spiritual equality of all genders and races.
You're not trying to say that this wickedness was cultural norms. We should
No,
defend it as
I'm not
cultural
saying
norms.
he endorsed it.
What I'm saying is that I think what you're looking at, I think there are some cultural things that are there that we may not value today in the same way that they did value. I don't think people today are overwhelmed, and I don't think the majority of women find their value on if they have a child. I don't think that. I mean, you tell me if I'm wrong. If that's the measure.
You're the wrong gender to speak for them.
No, but I'm asking that. Well, but I still can. It's not like I can't ask that question because I'm a male. Yeah, I'm asking the question. Is there? So if somebody doesn't have a child in our society, are they worthless? No, not at all, right? But that's how we see in the Bible. That's how they
You
felt.
see Abraham struggle with that too. Abraham felt slighted in that society because he didn't have a son.
And men don't, and today, so there's another cultural thing. Men, whether I have 5 daughters or 5, I don't have to have a son to go, oh no, if I don't have a son.
But I'm not talking about cultural norms. I'm talking about sins against women.
And I think God found those sins abhorrent. I don't think the Bible is a narrative on that, because I don't think he can. I don't
But
think
the
it can
question
do
is,
that.
why doesn't God call it out as wickedness?
I,
my question.
I think the Bible, by the examples that we see and the consequences Moses, the inspired writer, is wanting us to see,
So the
God does
parallel
not.
is God doesn't call out favoritism as wickedness either. And we can see by the example. That's your argument.
God doesn't call out the sin of favoritism
Yeah.
when it comes to Isaac and Rebekah and their favorite kids, but we're meant to see in Isaac and Rebekah and Jacob and Rachel and how he treats Joseph that there are consequences to showing favoritism. We're meant to look at Noah and the patriarchs who get drunk and go, there are consequences to getting drunk. We're meant to look at Abraham and his lying about his wife, and Isaac and him lying about his wife, and the polygamy, and go, there's consequences to this. This is not God's design. You even look ahead into David and Solomon with their polygamy post the law of Moses. We're meant to see in the writing of the way it's constructed that there are consequences to David's sins. There, if you look even the narrative of 1st and 2nd Samuel and how that narrative is constructed. Does that make sense?
I hear you. I think I'll also be asking God in heaven someday why you allowed it.
Yeah.
I have several thoughts on this. So one of them was, like, we're looking at these cultural events in the Old Testament, but there's, and saying, like, well, Jesus, like, addresses some of it.
He does.
But then he doesn't address stuff that now we look at, like slavery. We think slavery is important. He doesn't address racism.
Yeah.
He doesn't address he doesn't say anything bad about the Roman Empire. Like, but the Roman Empire was invading and slaughtering people. I mean, and those are all behaviors that we would abhor now, and I think that God abhors. But, and so for me, some of the takeaway though is I still think we're talking about this from a present day lens, and like 100 years from now, people are gonna look back on us and think, how could you be living like that? Like, we look back during the civil rights era and think, how could you be so awful to people then?
Yeah.
But if I grew up in that era, I would have been taught that it was okay, and in fact, the right thing for me to do.
Yeah.
To be cruel and abusive
But
towards
that's what
other
people like
races.
Rahab are so impressive, is she was able to stand against her culture for what God said was righteous. Right? Like, God's morality clause of righteousness is outside culture, right? And we value that, but why wouldn't God stand
But
up
we
and
are,
say,
but we are not outside culture. God is outside of culture, but we aren't. So
But
my,
we have
my point
patience.
is that we are going to have the same, not the same one, we're not polygamists, but we are going to have the same cultural errors that we are blind to because it's the culture that we live in. If I grew up in the time of the patriarchs, I don't know, theoretically, should I have been able to think back to creation and how God created one man and one woman and said that they were going to cleave to each other? Like, that's Jesus' point.
Yeah.
Yes, that example existed, but am I realistically likely to have done that? No. I probably would have had multiple wives just like everybody else. And, so we exist in a cultural zone, sphere. God doesn't. And like, part of the lesson, I think, is that we are, like, God is merciful to that. He also gives it to us to learn from.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that I was thinking about was, well, two things, sorry. One, I think that and I've read this about ancient Near Eastern teaching philosophy, like Western teaching, we want things like spelled out and just written
Yeah.
out and
Yeah.
tell you. Ancient Near East teaching, they tell a story, and everything that's weird or unusual or seems out of place, that's there intentionally for you
Yeah.
to have to think about and process. And so I really think all of these should be red flags. They're red flags because they are, like,
Yeah.
and we're supposed to be thoughtfully like, whoa, wait, shouldn't I think about that? Second point, though, is the narrative, and this kind of goes back to Chris's point about, like, this is not a morality narrative. God has, well, there's a lot to this. There's a specific narrative that's occurring, and the focus isn't on every single cultural value or norm. The focus is on, I would call out a big focus, like, despite Jacob's lying and deceiving and polygamy, as Hebrews points out, he has his sights set on the future. Like, he has his sights set on the future when he makes a deal as a young man to get the birthright. He has his sights set on the future to make to deceive, to get the covenant from God. He has his sights set on the future. Like, on one hand, yeah, he has 2 wives, but he worked 7 years for one, and then when he got deceived about it, he didn't throw her out to dry. Like, no, he wasn't great to her, but he didn't divorce her or leave her. He kept her, and then worked 7 more years for the woman he wanted. So, like, Jacob is a long-term goal person, and I think that there's, like, to me, that's the lesson that I'm getting from that, versus focusing on the morality, I guess, because it doesn't seem like that's the emphasis
Yeah.
of the
Genesis
narrative.
is the story of God's relentless love towards us. It's
Right.
not the story of these men as holding up the righteous. They're righteous because Christ's blood cleansed them,
Yeah.
not because their own actions were good. I think my overall question was just, why doesn't God ever say,
Yeah.
this is bad?
Yeah.
I mean, but he doesn't do that for women. I mean, he didn't do that for Rahab either. He didn't focus on the fact that Rahab was a prostitute. He focused on the fact that Rahab was righteous in his eyes because of her faith.
And that's a great example from a female perspective, just real quickly, because, and then we need to move on, because Rahab, she lies. She's declared her faith. She knows God is going to destroy the city, but she lies, and they don't dwell on the lie. Your husband asked an awesome question back when we were looking at Joshua a year ago in our Sunday morning class. What about this? Like, yeah, he was the one. What about the lie? Anyways, so
I will
you can tell him I said hey. But the Bible doesn't dwell on the lie; it dwells on her faith.
That's true.
The Bible doesn't dwell on Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob's sin; it dwells on their faith, because that's, I think, the primary focus. Yes, we're meant to learn. Hey, maybe Rahab lied here. Abraham sinned. Isaac sinned. But the focus is on faith and what that faith brings. And you mentioned it a moment ago, Christ. They're looking forward to, as Kevin said a moment ago, anticipating Christ there in the text.
One last thing that I was going to say was, like, thinking about, like, why doesn't Jesus address, like, white slavery's talked a lot about,
Yeah.
but why doesn't God he doesn't hit it, like, he doesn't address it in the Old Testament. He doesn't
Yeah.
say get rid of it in the Old Testament. He doesn't say get rid of it in the New Testament.
Yeah.
And I think that, like, because we can't exist outside of the culture we live in, God teaches us how to operate within the culture that we have. And if we live in accordance with God's ways, then
Yeah.
those things will eventually
Exactly.
go away. Slavery will fizzle out and die.
It was the wider.
Polygamy will fizzle out and go away. But if you're in the moment, and you can't subvert this entire cultural norm. Like, I can't subvert the entire cultural norm that homosexuality is okay now.
Yeah.
Like, we can't undo that with a snap of the fingers. But we have to understand how to behave and operate within that.
Yeah. And I think the slavery, your example there is one we could dwell on and think and wrestle with a while. But we are going to try to get back in Genesis because this was a great discussion. Because that's one of the things you see, and we've seen over the last several weeks, to Lisa's overall question, these patriarchs, these heroes of faith that we read about in Hebrews 11, and we hold up and we teach our kids in the back, like Jackson and Finn, and say, look at the example of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and their faith. And while Lisa and Desiree are doing such an excellent job teaching them back there, they're probably reading going, that's PG-13. You know, this is not Disney. This is, you know, and wrestling with their sins. But let's get into the text real quick. And there is this sin present in this story. We see God's grace and God's mercy repeated over and over and over again. But Jacob and Leah are married. Jacob and Rachel are married. And Jacob, verse 30, loved Rachel more than Leah. And what's the consequence of that? Verse 31, the Lord saw that Leah was neglected. And he, that's the Lord, opened her womb. But Rachel was unable to conceive. We see this favoritism theme playing out. The consequences of that. We see a barren woman introduced into the story again. Sarah was barren. Isaac was barren. Or not Isaac. Isaac, of course, would be barren. But Rebecca was barren. And now Rachel is barren. And Leah has a kid. 1, 2, 3, 4 by the end of the chapter. Rachel's over here going, I want a kid. I want a child for my family. So what does she do? Here's my handmaiden. 1, 2 kids. All the way to verse 8. Well, Leah's over here going, well, it's been a while. Here's my slave. Have some kids with my slave. And so 1, 2 kids are born. And one day Reuben's out working in the fields and finds some mandrakes, which had in that ancient world some qualities that were believed to help in the bedroom. And they barter. And so Leah gets Jacob that night. And Leah has another son and a 6th son. And finally a daughter named Dinah. And then the Lord remembered Rachel and opened her womb. And she had Joseph. But as you were reading Genesis chapter 28 or 29 and 30, what did the names of the children tell us about Leah and Rachel? And I'll even include the names of the kids that they're slaves or their handmaidens or their concubines, whatever term your translation may say. Tell us about them. What does the names of the kids tell us? Yeah.
I guess you really need to know how the two moms feel.
Yeah.
Both emotionally and also spiritually too.
Yeah. Yeah. Like you see how the moms feel. Look at the progression of Leah's names for her sons. Like going back to Chris's comment a moment ago. In the ancient world, like today, you have a boy, you have a girl, you're happy either way. You may, as a father, be particularly wanting a son to throw football in the front yard. I was. That's okay. I hope. Or if you may want a daughter to pass down and to teach how to do, whatever. That's okay. But in the ancient world, like a son, especially the oldest son, was tantamount to a rock star. Like, you wanted sons for a variety of reasons. And so Leah has a son, Reuben. The Lord has seen my affliction. He's seen that I've been ignored. The second son. I'm neglected. He's given me another son. A third son. Maybe my husband will actually love me. He'll be attached to me. Finally, and fourth. Okay, now I'm going to praise God. You see that progression? And you see some of those progressions there and how they treat those sons and how those sons meet the moment they're in. Anything else about those names jump out to you? Yeah.
You didn't mention the 5th son's name. It's in verse 18.
Verse 18. Issachar?
God has given me my wages because I gave my servant to my husband.
Again. Yeah. So there are all these names, and those names meant something. They were important. Sometimes they're puns or sound similar to the actual Hebrew word. Yeah, there in verse 18, wrestling with the question we were for like the first 15 minutes of class of what's going on here with this sin. But these names mean something to those women at that time as they're having. And so Jacob's family is growing. Go back a couple of chapters if you remember. Ishmael has how many kids? 12. How many is Jacob going to end up with? 12 eventually. 12 with one daughter, so 13 total. Baker's dozen. And so Jacob is his family is growing, and like in this story, like every strategy is taken to gain the upper hand, from prayer to substitute wives to badgering to bartering to superstition with the mandrakes there in the text. But Jacob's family's huge, and so Jacob goes to Laban after a period of time and says, "Hey, it's time for me to go home. I've got a big family. I'm tired of working for you. If I don't start growing my own flocks, I'm going to be a broke man. I need to have something to pass down and take care of my family." So they work out a bargain, and that bargain is what? What's the bargain that Laban and Jacob strike?
Jacob's gonna take the speckled or striped,
Yeah.
the black sheep.
Yeah. The black sheep of the family is going to take the black sheep, and Laban's going to get the pure and one. And so what ends up happening? What does Laban do? He takes all the speckled ones and takes them 3 days away. And what does Jacob do in response?
He peels the,
Peels.
branch or something.
Yeah, like a branch. And so when the good, strong sheep are mating by the water, he puts that branch out. And when the weak ones are, he doesn't. And so what's the process? What ends up happening over a period of time? Jacob ends up with the strong sheep and the good sheep. Laban does not. So they're both, what are they doing?
Cheaters.
They're both cheaters. Let's be honest. Like, going back to the overall question that we were wrestling with and spent so much time wrestling with, I think we need to look at this story. And yeah, it's hilarious how you have these two guys who are mirror images of themselves, perhaps decades apart in age, trying to one-up each other, and this cheating rivalry thing here in the text. And so really, like, let's think about it. How does rivalry shape this family here in Genesis 30? Like, as you see the family grow and you see the flocks grow, what is this rivalry, what kind of effect does it have on this family? Is it good or bad? Jealousy,
Competition.
deceit, competition. I think we're meant to look at this and go, these are not characteristics that should be characterizing the people of God. Yes, it's one of those times in the biblical story that it's humorous and we laugh at because it is ironic or funny or whatever the technical literary term is. But it's also sad because you have these two people who can't deal honestly with one another because they're too busy trying to one-up each other. Anything else you guys see there in Genesis 30 all the way to the end of the chapter? Anything jump out to you guys? So in Genesis chapter 31, that Jacob heard that Laban's sons were saying, this is verse 1, that Jacob has taken all that was our father's and built this wealth from what belonged to our fathers. Like, they're going, we have no inheritance. Jacob has killed our inheritance. And Jacob saw that Laban's face, that his attitude toward him was not the same as before. So And the Lord said to him, go back to the land of your ancestors and to your family, and I will be with you. Go back a couple chapters ago to where we closed out last week, Genesis 28. What did God tell Jacob there at Bethel? I will be with you. Go. I'm going to be with you on the journey, and there's that bargain they make. Now God says, okay, enough time over here in Mesopotamia. Time for you to go back, and I'm going to be with you. So Jacob called his wives. Your father's attitude toward me has changed. He has changed my wages 10 times. It's time for me to leave. And get this, I want to focus in on verse 7 and verse 9. 2 times there in the text. Even though Laban has tried to cheat Jacob, God has not let him harm me. He realizes something about Laban and something about this journey. The light bulb seems to be going off in Jacob's mind that God is there and God is watching out for him, even as he still wrestles with these issues of morality in his own life, and this deceit that has characterized his own life. And so he tells him, it's like, okay. There in verse 13, that he needs to go back to the God of Bethel and go back to that point. Genesis 28. Go back there. And the wives are on board. So when Laban goes to shear his sheep, Rachel stole her household idols, and Jacob deceived Laban. Again, what's the rivalry? What's the problem here? Rachel stealing. There's something going on there, and Jacob's deceiving. Yes, Leah. Not Leah.
It's okay.
Lisa.
I understand. So it seems like we're suggesting that God blessed Jacob through his cheating. Right? Is that what you're suggesting?
I am saying that God found a way to use this situation to accomplish his purpose. That God promised to bless Jacob, and he used Jacob's deceiving to accomplish that purpose. God would have blessed Jacob if Jacob was a perfectly honest businessman. But he used that to accomplish his purpose.
Okay.
That makes sense?
In spite of, not because.
Yeah, in spite of, not because of. Yeah. In the same way, you see that throughout Scripture. That God, and this is something really, I think, would be helpful for us to understand when we think about the power of God. That our God is so powerful that if he has a will to do something, he will do it. There's nothing we can do to stop it. Like, if the Jews 2,000 years ago didn't want to crucify Jesus, God would have found a way for his plan to come through for fruition. Yeah. Lisa, and then Chris, and then Kevin.
I just point out that I think in verse 8 we're seeing Jacob's reflection of what happened.
Yeah.
So Jacob is saying, God did not permit him to harm me. God blessed me through the crops. I mean, through the things like we're seeing Jacob's revisionist history.
Yeah.
This is all God's doing.
Yeah.
So I think we can't always drink our own Kool-Aid, right? Like I
Yeah.
paid up my taxes and God blessed me with some wealth. It's probably not a great perspective.
Yeah, but that's a good point. And I don't want to spoil the surprise, but you are going to see, if you look at where Jacob starts and where Jacob's going to end up, you do see like this little baby steps of spiritual growth along the way. And I think you're right that you can't, read your own press clippings, and perhaps maybe Jacob is reading his own press clippings.
Yeah.
But I do believe this is maybe a small hint, that a small light bulb is starting to go off in his mind, that Jacob needs to get serious about God. And we're going to see more of that next week as Jacob's journey continues. And he gets closer and closer to Bethel and gets a little more serious about spiritual things. But I think if you zoom out and like look at the holistic view of Jacob's life, you're starting to see some light bulbs go off.
I get that, but what you're saying is we should find our own morality red flags in here and apply them to ourselves. That's God's intention, is for us to see the drunkenness and realize for ourselves, oh, we we shouldn't be doing that.
Yeah.
We should see Jacob make this conclusion and draw the same conclusion about our life, that we shouldn't be like that. That is the lesson we should be getting,
Yeah.
is we can convince ourselves that God's blessing us because we're righteous,
Yeah,
even
I
though
see
we're
what you're saying.
behaving
Yeah.
badly.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, yeah, I see what you're saying there. Okay, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of where my point was there's no, it's, the things that he's doing, the sins that we've committed are no less atrocious to God in terms of transaction of sin than the things that they're doing there. But it's super easy for us to say, well, yeah, at least we're not Jacob,
Yeah.
or at least we're not whoever. But the fact of the matter is, and God, in his love and his favor, is faithful to his promise in spite of
Yeah,
the sin and the flaws
Yeah.
and the issues that Jacob and these other patriarchs exhibit over and over and over again.
and I think the difference that you're pointing out there, Chris, in spite of, not because of, is so important. That God is faithful to his promise, not because of the sin, in spite of the sin. And you see that really throughout the entire Old Testament, of God always being faithful to his promise in spite of our sin. Yeah, Kevin.
What that part of it made me think of is when the nation of Israel was going into Canaan to conquer it, God specifically tells them it's not because of your righteousness, but because their wickedness of the nation
Yeah.
has reached its fullness, and because of the covenant that I made.
Yeah.
And what I don't think is spelled out here for us, but I think like same thing could be happening, because this happens thematically throughout the Bible over and over and over again. God uses somebody else who's not necessarily a great person to punish another person
Yeah.
who needs
Yeah.
to be punished. And so I think that could be at play here, because Laban's obviously also not a great person. So
Yeah.
the fact that Jacob's not a good person either, just he's could be punishing Laban.
Yeah.
And then the second thing I guess I want to think of is like it's possible that Jacob is talking about his wealth from the standpoint of like what we see later in scriptures, where the Jews in the New Testament think if you're wealthy, that means God blessed you because you're righteous, and if you're poor, then that means you're an evil person and you're punished.
Yeah.
That could be the mentality.
Yeah.
I also don't want to throw out the possibility that just because you acquire wealth evilly, and maybe you're even continuing to do this in behavior, doesn't preclude you from also having gratitude to God.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that justifies it, but it's something.
Yeah.
And I guess and that kind of speaks more to what seeing a progression of Jacob. And to me, I kind of see this as all right, here's one of those little inklings again about because what on earth does God see in Jacob?
Yeah.
That to me, that's one of the big things that I'm looking for, because Jacob seems crummy. I would not want to be friends with Jacob. I would be steering clear of him and his family. Finn would not be playing with his kids on the playground.
All 12 of them.
So again, as far as red flags to me, it's well, wait a second, I think Jacob's an awful person, but God chose him?
Yeah.
So what am I missing? What does God see that I'm not seeing?
So a couple of things on this note as we're looking through at least the text tonight. I'm skimming as you guys were talking, if you'll allow me to confess that. One of the things I see up until this point is Jacob, at least in my quick skim of 29 and 30 and 31, never uses the word Lord, all caps. The covenantal name, that is Yahweh, that's most Bible translations can translate that, Lord, all caps. It's always God. Which is interesting to note, because the Lord, that name is usually connected to people with a stronger faith connection, a stronger walk with God. Jacob just uses the name God, the very basic name for God, which is El in the Hebrew, which was the same name, to be honest, of some of the Canaanite gods. So in this faith journey, he's not reached that point where it's strongly, deeply, intimately personal quite yet, at least in these couple of chapters. Yeah, Lisa.
I wanted to respond to Kevin with 2 points. One, the righteousness of God makes Lot righteous, and the righteousness of God makes Abraham righteous, and the righteousness of God makes Jacob righteous, not their own behaviors.
Yeah.
So we don't have to look at their behaviors and try and find what God saw in them. God saw Christ in them.
Yeah.
That's what makes you righteous.
Yeah.
And the second thing is
But-
that, go ahead.
But there are people that he also looks at and finds not faithful. So
Yeah,
there
they
are
didn't have faith in
differences.
Jesus or didn't have faith in God. It's the faith that makes them righteous, not their behaviors. So we don't have to look at their behaviors and say, what did God see in them? Why did he make Abraham his prophet? He made
But
Abraham
faith
his
and
prophet
behaviors are
because he
not,
chose him.
faith and behaviors are intertwined, they're not.
And you look at like the Israelite people weren't better than the other people. They were just God's chosen vehicle, right? And so God chooses vehicles not because their behavior is what it should be, right? So I don't think we need to look at these men of faith and say, well, there was something redeeming about them because I know because God chose them. Like, no, God chose them, and then their faith in him made them righteous, not their behaviors, right? When we see the Bible say, and Abraham was walked with God as a man of
Yeah.
faith, it's the faith in God that made Abraham
Yeah.
righteous, not any of his behaviors,
Yes,
right?
but you're splitting behaviors and faith, and I don't think that the scripture splits behaviors and faith.
And I hear you,
When-
but
When
what
Paul
we
talks
read
about
of them-
faith in Romans,
what we read of them is mostly bad.
correct.
We see Abraham follow,
So what,
leave his
so
home.
where are there,
Like,
so
we can
where
find
do
a
we,
couple
s-
of things.
so where do we see acts of faith?
We see acts of faith when Abraham moves, like when he walks and follows God and leaves his home,
So,
right?
so
But we
what,
also-
what I'm trying to say is here, for example, when Jacob says, God gave me this wealth,
Yeah,
that could be a profession of faith.
I hear you, but here's my second point with that. God says, don't hate your brother and give your alms to me on Sunday. That is dirty to me. So the lack of humility in our heart towards others can injure our ability to be right with God. Right?
That's true too.
So when Jacob cheats Laban and then says, thanks God for it, do I think that's a pleasant aroma to God? Do I? I'm gonna go with, I don't think so. I mean, I get what you're saying, that God appreciates small movements of faith, and if our heart is turning towards him, then God's gonna honor that. But in general, we can't act like we don't live by the standard of God's righteousness, and then think that God's gonna be grateful that we aren't as wicked as we used to be, right? Like, God expects us to look at our hearts and become people of humility who put others before ourselves, all these things, and we can't just not behave that way.
But I think God does look at, like, I'm less wicked than I was, 5 years ago.
That's Chris's argument too for why like racism can be fixed slowly. I shouldn't speak for Chris, but I've heard that argument before.
But my point, like, but my transition of,
Chris is like, why am I taking hits?
my life transition is because of my faith in
Yeah.
God, which I think
Yeah.
is what is, like, God's looking for.
Amanda.
I think we're kind of forgetting that, like, we're getting snippets of these people's
Yeah.
lives.
Exactly.
And it's like, you have Abraham who lives well over 100 years. You get a handful of chapters about the man. You have
Yeah.
some good stories and some bad stories. But there's like almost
Yeah.
a century of material that we don't know at
Yeah.
all.
Yeah.
And God is looking at this person and saying, they are faithful. And
Yeah.
that means he's taking the imperfect parts of them too. And
To-
I think that should be comforting to us that we don't have to be perfect.
So to Amanda's point, think about it. Like Abraham lives 120 something years. Let's go. We have maybe 12 days worth of material in Abraham's life. You know that he takes up 12 or so chapters. Let's assume each chapter is a day, couple of days. You do the math on how many days he lived. And so, to the overall point that we've been kind of wrestling with today, it's not an excuse for sin. In any way, we should avoid sin. And I love what Lisa's saying in terms of the loving and how we treat others and affects our relationship with God. We need to avoid sin at all costs. That's what it means to walk by faith. But we also need to realize that much like the patriarchs, that we do have moments in our life, even now, after we've become Christians, where we have episodes, where we have moments where we fall and we fail and we bottom out. And much like we've been circling back to several times tonight, in terms of God's grace is still there. And that's something that should be comforting for us as we strive to walk with God, just like Abraham is trying to walk with God, and Isaac's trying to walk with God, and Jacob's trying to walk with God. And I don't want to spoil the surprise, but go to the end of Genesis. If you have a chance, go to the end of Genesis sometime this week and read what Jacob says at the end of Genesis. Jacob's faith grows in his journey with God. Is he perfect? No. Is Abraham perfect? No. Is Isaac perfect? No. Do they have sins? Absolutely. But I think if you look at the snippets and the stories that we do have, I think we see examples of their faith growing on their journey with God. Yeah, Chris.
Dan May, in this part, Dan May always says, I'm never going to be sinless, but hopefully as I get older, I sin less.
Yeah.
And I think that's the walk.
Yeah. And like, I know all of us can go back in our lives and look at moments and go, I hope no one writes about this when they write my biography. Like, I'm going to go off the microphone real quick. I hope no one writes about the time I was going 95 on I-75. It's going so fast in my four-door Honda Civic that my car was shaking. Like, I don't want that to be in my biography. Did it happen? Yes. Am I proud of it? No, which is why I took off the microphone. But we are at the end of our class tonight. And on that note, we will continue in Genesis next week. But on that note, class dismissed.